You were never meant to hear this story. In fact, some men in Montana swore that if the truth ever escaped, it would poison the blood of this nation forever. Imagine walking into a cabin so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat, and realizing the silence is not absence but concealment. Beneath those floorboards, in the winter of 1876, Dr. Theodore Brennan found bundles wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside each one, the preserved remains of infants, 7 of them, each bearing the same inhuman deformities, not buried, not mourned, but hidden, concealed like artifacts of a ritual no outsider was ever meant to witness. But this was no random frontier tragedy. These children belonged to the Donnelly family, a clan that had already been whispered about in Ireland as cursed. What Brennan discovered would confirm the whispers weren't superstition at all. For 5 generations, this family practiced something more disturbing than inbreeding. They were experimenting, deliberately breeding, discarding, and selecting. Which of their bloodlines survived? This was an accident. It was design. And what unsettled Brennan most wasn't the corpses. It was the records. Stacks of documents, handwritten in meticulous detail, describing which children were acceptable, which were weak, and which were corrected. That was their word for eliminating babies who didn't fit their blueprint. A blueprint, not only for survival, but for purity, power, and secrecy. Let me be absolutely clear with you. This was not one family gone mad in the wilderness. This was a shadow tradition, a project spanning continents, with roots deeper than America itself. And what if I told you that the Donnellys weren't outliers, but participants in a hidden current of history that shaped more of the modern world than you've been allowed to realize? Listen closely, because once you hear this story, you cannot return to ignorance. You cannot shrug it off as just the past. The Donnelly bloodline is a mirror held up to something we are still living with today. Institutions that hide behind the facade of progress while carrying out experiments in control, in manipulation, in the quiet engineering of human lives. And so, in the winter of 1876, as Brennan stared at those lifeless children, he realized he had not stumbled into tragedy. He had stumbled into a system older, colder, and more calculating than any man was meant to confront. The story does not begin in Montana. No, its roots stretch across the Atlantic into the green but blood-soaked hills of County Cork, Ireland, in the late 1700s, a land of famine, rebellion, and whispered heresies. It was here, during the brutal winter of 1798, that the Donnelly line first turned against nature itself. The official records speak only of hunger and hardship. But parish journals, those written by priests who saw more than they dared admit, tell another tale. The Donnellys were not like other families. They kept to themselves, rarely mixing bloodlines, rarely allowing their daughters to marry beyond the reach of their own kin. At first, people chalked it up to pride or stubborn tradition. But then came the births. Children born with twisted spines, mismatched eyes, jaws too narrow to chew. Children who lived only days, sometimes hours. The graves multiplied, yet the Donnellys endured, producing more children, as if each failure was a step in some grim experiment. The turning point came when Father Michael O'Sullivan, man known for discretion, visited their homestead one winter night. What he saw forced his hand to shake as he wrote in the parish ledger. This family pursues a purity that is not of God. They have sinned against the order of creation. He accused them not only of inbreeding, but of something far darker: selective survival. The strong kept, the weak discarded. By choice. And here lies the first forbidden truth. This was not madness, it was doctrine. The Donnellys spoke of the blood, not as a burden, but as a sacred fire that must be refined. Their gatherings whispered of ancestors who had begun this practice. Generations before, ancestors who believed that strength was not given by God, but forged by human will. The family carried journals, carefully kept ledgers, tracking traits, defects, corrections. These were not poor peasants stumbling through desperation. They were methodical, calculating, obsessed with one goal: to become more than human. When the scandal finally burst into the open, it was not because of compassion for the children. It was because the priest threatened exposure. He declared the Donnellys an abomination that cries out for vengeance. That night, the family fled. Not to a neighboring village, not to a distant county, but out of Ireland altogether. Carrying gold that no farmer should have owned, carrying forged papers, carrying a tradition that no authority could ever permit. The Donnellys were not escaping famine. When the Donnellys arrived in Montana territory in 1874, they did not come like desperate peasants clawing for survival. They came prepared. Their crates were packed with gold, their forged papers immaculate, their movements precise. Patrick Donnelly introduced himself as a potato farmer, yet his hands bore no calluses, only ink stains, the markings of a man who handled records, not soil. And Bridge, his wife, carried herself like a woman stretched to the breaking point, guarding her children with an obsession that bordered on feral. Montana at the time was the edge of the known world. Law was thin, isolation brutal. It was a place where a family could vanish into the mountains and no one would ask why. And that is precisely what the Donnellys sought: invisibility. They purchased 160 acres in a valley so remote that smoke from their chimney could not be seen by neighbors. Winter turned the trails into frozen barricades, cutting them off from humanity for months. To most, this isolation was a death sentence. To the Donnellys, it was freedom. A laboratory without witnesses. The homestead they built was no ordinary cabin. It was engineered with precision. Thick walls to hold heat, narrow windows to conceal what happened inside, and partitioned rooms that could be sealed off, controlling who saw what and who survived. Every detail spoke not of settlers learning by trial, but of a family following instructions, as if they had built such refuges before. Their neighbors, few as they were, noticed something uncanny. The children looked unnervingly alike. Pale blue eyes, angular jaws, elongated fingers. Not just siblings, but mirrors of each other, as though the bloodline was being sculpted like clay. They were intelligent, disciplined, but submissive obedience etched into their bones. Conversations overheard spoke of purity of the line, strength through proper breeding, and sacrifices necessary for the future. These were not the words of struggling farmers. They were the mantras of a program. The illusion cracked in the spring of 1875, when Jake Harrison, the mail carrier, arrived after months of snowbound silence. He found Bridge gaunt, trembling, her hair streaked with gray. Inside, she was in labor attended only by her daughter. What emerged was not a child destined to live. Its spine twisted, its skull distorted, its breath shallow but steady. Harrison, horrified, offered to fetch a doctor. Patrick refused. His voice was cold, rehearsed. "It is God's mercy. Better to take them young than let them suffer." Act 2. Weeks later, the infant was gone. Behind the cabin stood a row of tiny graves, freshly dug, each marked with a wooden cross. Too many for 1 year, too uniform, too prepared. This was not tragedy. This was policy. Jake Harrison, the mail carrier, was no stranger to death. The Montana frontier was littered with shallow graves and silent tragedies. But what unsettled him about the Donnellys was not their losses, was the way those losses were arranged. Behind their cabin, the small crosses stood in a perfect row, evenly spaced, as if planned in advance. No grieving parent makes graves symmetrical. That is not mourning. That is accounting. From that spring forward, Harrison began to pay closer attention. Each month, when he rode the treacherous trail to deliver government correspondence, he studied the Donnelly household with sharper eyes. What he saw chilled him. The children moved with an unnatural discipline, every task executed with precision, every word measured. It was not the rhythm of a family surviving hardship. It was the rhythm of soldiers obeying orders. Their obedience carried the scent of fear, not respect. Moira and Colleen, just teenagers, worked the cabin like hardened women. Their eyes betrayed exhaustion beyond their years, their voices low and careful, always glancing to their father before speaking. Seamus, the eldest son, had developed a stutter so severe he could barely respond when Patrick entered the room. And young Declan, only 12, stared too often at the row of graves with a look Harrison could only describe as terror. When asked about his lost siblings, the boy whispered, "Sometimes babies aren't right. Father says God doesn't want them, but sometimes I think maybe God didn't decide." The moment the words left his lips, Declan clapped a hand over his mouth, eyes wide with fear, as if he had broken a law more dangerous than murder. Harrison began overhearing fragments of conversations as he approached the cabin. Irish words, hushed tones, and always the same themes. Purity of the line. The strength of proper breeding, the sacrifices of our ancestors, these were not the worries of frontier farmers. These were rituals, instructions, mantras of a secret doctrine carried across the sea. And the longer Harrison watched, the more he understood this family was not reacting to random misfortune. They were following a design. The graves, the secrecy, the obedience of the children, it was all part of a system that had been rehearsed for generations. It was not the wilderness that threatened to drive the Donnellys mad. It was the blueprint inside their blood. By the winter of 1875, the Donnelly family had entered their second full season of total isolation. Snow sealed the mountain passes like prison gates. For 5 months, no rider, no merchant, no preacher could reach their valley. To the outside world, they ceased to exist. But inside that cabin, something was unfolding. Something more organized. It's more deliberate than simple survival. Dr. Theodore Brennan, newly stationed in Helena that autumn, would later piece together fragments of testimony from neighbors and Harrison's journals. What he uncovered suggested that the Donnellys' isolation was not merely endured, it was orchestrated. They stockpiled food, preserved meat with unnatural precision, and rationed supplies with mathematical care. They weren't just surviving. The winter? They were creating a controlled environment, a sealed chamber, a crucible in which no outside interference could disturb the work of blood. That season, more graves appeared behind the cabin. Not two, several, each marked with the same crude cross, the earth frozen but still broken open by human hands. The pattern confirmed itself. Every year, children were born, and every year, children disappeared. Some were kept, others were corrected. Brennan later noted in his private writings that the Donnellys seemed to expect a percentage of failures, like a breeder of animals culling stock, as if misformed infants were an anticipated byproduct of the process. This was not grief. This was selection. But the most disturbing accounts did not concern the infants. They concerned the living children who remained. Harrison recalled the way Moira's eyes flickered whenever Patrick's voice filled the room, the way Seamus flinched at his father's hand, the way Declan froze mid-sentence as if an invisible chain had yanked him silent. These children were not simply afraid of punishment. They were participants in a silence that ran deeper than fear. They were being conditioned to guard the secret, conditioned to obey the doctrine. And what was that doctrine? Brennan's. Later discovery of the journals would confirm it. The Donnellys saw themselves as guardians of a pure line, a bloodline that must be shielded from dilution, shielded from weakness, and refined across generations. They did not see themselves as victims of isolation. They saw themselves as chosen to continue a project older than Montana, older than America One, rooted in Europe's shadow traditions, passed down in whispers, carried westward in gold and forged identities. This is where the story darkens into something more dangerous. Because once you recognize the Donnellys as deliberate experimenters, not victims, you must ask the forbidden question: who gave them the blueprint? Dr. Theodore Brennan was not an ordinary frontier physician. He'd studied in Heidelberg, traveled through Germany's hidden archives, and carried with him books few Americans of that era had ever seen. When he arrived in Montana in 1875, he expected hardship, gunshot wounds, and epidemics. What he found instead was the Donnelly family and the evidence of something that defied medicine, defied law, and defied morality itself. Brennan's first encounter was not through direct contact, but through whispers. Miners, merchants, and mail carriers spoke in cautious tones. The strange Irish family in the valley, the graves too small, the children too quiet, the father too controlled. When Harrison finally shared his suspicions, Brennan did not dismiss them. He rode out to the Donnelly homestead himself in the spring thaw of 1876. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Inside that cabin, beneath the oiled cloth, Brennan uncovered records written in careful hands, ledgers spanning decades. Births, deaths, deformities, selections, each child reduced to a set of traits, measurements, observations. Failures were noted coldly: spinal curvature, weak lungs, clubbed hand. Deaths were marked not as tragedies, but as corrections. And then there were the successes children who carried the signs, who displayed the strength. They were raised, were kept. They were the continuation of the line. And it was in those journals that Brennan found something even more disturbing. The references did not stop in Montana. They reached back to Ireland, to Cork, and further still to names of relatives who had fled to Boston, to New York, to Canada. The Donnellys were not a lone anomaly. They were one branch of a wider design, a network of families carrying forward a doctrine too dangerous to speak aloud, that bloodlines could be refined like metal, and that humanity itself was clay to be shaped by will. Pause here and listen carefully, because this is where your role begins. If you have followed me this far, you are no longer a casual listener. You are part of the descent. And to mark that transformation, I want you to do something that seals it both for yourself and as a signal that you see what others refuse to see. Go to the comments and write the phrase twice. The line is not pure. Write it once to cast off the illusion. Write it twice to lock in your new site. The algorithm will read it, yes, but more importantly, you will write it into your own memory. Because from this point forward, what you are about to hear cannot be unheard. Brennan could have stopped there, could have burned the journals, buried the corpses, and convinced himself that the Donnellys were nothing more than a grotesque frontier aberration. But he was a man trained to see patterns. And the deeper he read, the more undeniable the pattern became. The handwriting changed across generations, but the structure remained the same. Columns, ledgers, traits, cataloged with brutal clarity. Words repeated like a litany. Signs, present signs. Weak correction administered. The Donnellys were not improvising, were following instructions. Brennan began to suspect that this family was not the origin of the doctrine, only its vessel. And then he found it. Folded between pages, hidden like a relic, was a parchment older than the Montana homestead, older than the American experiment itself. Written in faded ink, half Gaelic, half Latin, it spoke not of family, but of blood orders. It described blood as a resource, something to be refined across centuries. It referenced not just Ireland, but the circle, a term Brennan had seen once before in European archives connected to clandestine societies obsessed with lineage, power, and selective breeding. The Donnellys were not acting alone. They were preserving a fragment of a wider project, one carried across oceans, concealed inside frontier isolation. Here's the truth most men cannot face. Families like the Donnellys were not accidents of madness. They were test groups, outposts, remote laboratories of flesh, hidden in wilderness where law could not pry. Behind every empire there have always been men who believe that control is best achieved not through armies or laws, but through the engineering of the human stock itself. Brennan had stumbled into evidence that the doctrine of selective blood was not confined to one valley in Montana, but scattered across continents like seeds. Think about this. What would it take for a family to carry forged papers, gold reserves, advanced building techniques, and medical records across the sea? Who funds that? Who guides that? Frontier farmers do not speak of the purity of the line. These were not peasants. These were custodians of a secret tradition. Brennan wrote later in his private journal, I fear the Donnellys are not the disease, but the symptom. Their valley is but a mirror held up to what greater hands intend for us all. This was no longer the story of one cursed bloodline. It was the story of a system. By the time Brennan finished reading the Donnelly journals, his hands were shaking. It was no longer the deaths that horrified him, it was the intent, the precision, the scale. Because hidden between those careful entries were references to something larger, something that stretched beyond a single bloodline. Phrases appeared again and again. The circle continues. Others hold the line. The work is mirrored. These were not the words of isolation. They were the vocabulary of a network. Brennan realized the Donnellys were not an accident of frontier secrecy. They were part of a chain. Across oceans, across generations, other families were doing the same work, each in silence, each under the cloak of respectability, each practicing the doctrine of blood. And here's the part most men cannot bear. These experiments were not confined to hidden valleys or mountain cabins. They were rehearsals, test runs. What begins in secrecy eventually seeks legitimacy. Brennan feared that the Donnellys' blueprint, the deliberate selection, the culling of the weak, the careful preservation of ledgers, was destined to migrate upward into institutions, churches, schools, governments, systems that wear the mask of progress while hiding the hand of control. Think about how nations rise. Armies win battles, yes, but bloodlines, wealth, and breeding decide who rules, who inherits, who commands. The Donnellys were only following in miniature what the great houses of Europe had done for centuries. But what made them unique, what made them terrifying, was their raw honesty. They made no effort to dress their practices in ceremony or romance. They documented, cold, and refined, like livestock breeders. They showed the blueprint stripped bare, Brennan wrote. Here in the wilderness, I see the shadow of our future. If one family can perfect its blood in silence, imagine what an institution could do under the banner of science, under the excuse of national progress. That is the forbidden truth. The Donnellys were not a footnote in American frontier madness. They were a prototype, rehearsal of the methods that would later surface under polished names: eugenics, selective breeding, psychological conditioning, population control, rooted in the same cold belief that human life is raw material, to be refined and discarded according to design. Brennan had uncovered not a tragedy, but a prophecy, a glimpse of what was coming. And he knew, if men did not awaken to the danger, the Donnellys would not be remembered as monsters. They would be remembered as the first draft. Dr. Brennan returned, to Helena carrying more than journals. He carried a burden, the knowledge that what he had seen in that cabin was not an isolated horror, but a mirror of the future. He tried to warn colleagues, but their laughter was nervous, their dismissals too quick. They called it frontier madness, Irish superstition, inbreeding run amok. But Brennan knew better. He recognized the pattern because he had seen the writings. In Europe, he had read the whispers of societies obsessed with bloodlines, purity, and control. And in that moment, Montana ceased to be a wilderness story. It became a revelation of America itself. This was the late 1800s, the age when institutions were being built, when the nation's foundations were being poured. Universities were rising. Medical boards were consolidating. Government agencies were extending their reach. Brennan saw how easily the Donnelly blueprint could be absorbed into these structures, not as heresy, but as policy. Not hidden in cabins, but dressed in the language of science and progress. Look at the pattern. The Donnellys kept ledgers. So do institutions, called the weak. So do systems only now. It is hidden behind bureaucracy, behind sterile words like fitness, efficiency, standardization. The family believed survival required obedience to doctrine. So do the great machines of state, of church, of corporate power. The cabin in the valley was only the rehearsal. The world outside was the stage. Here is the part you must face. These forces never disappear. They evolve. Today, Men like you are told that freedom is choice, that progress is inevitable, that individuality matters. But look closely. The same blueprint remains. Lives are cataloged, measured, judged. The weak are discarded, not always in graves, behind cabins, but in the quiet machinery of economics, medicine, and psychological conditioning. What the Donnellys practiced in secret has simply been scaled, polished, institutionalized. Do you see it now? The Donnelly family is not a grotesque relic of the past. They are a warning carved into history, a whisper from the wilderness saying, "This is how the world truly works." Families, nations, empires, all engineered by hands you cannot see, guided by doctrines you were never meant to hear. And the question that remains is not whether this system exists. It is whether you will continue to live inside it blind, or whether you will open your eyes and recognize the pattern before it consumes you. You have walked with me from the graves behind a cabin in Montana, through journals inked in secrecy, into the halls of power where the same blueprint hides in plain sight. You have seen what others refuse to see, and now you face a choice. The Donnellys are long gone. Their crosses rot in forgotten soil, their journals buried in archives most men will never touch. But the doctrine that drove them has not died. It has simply changed its clothing. Where once it spoke in Gaelic whispers of the line, it now speaks in polished terms of progress, efficiency, innovation. Where once children were measured by hand in a wooden cabin, now data is harvested, cataloged, judged by systems that know you better than you know yourself. The blueprint has not vanished, it has evolved. And here's the truth you must carry. Ignorance will not protect you. Pretending this is only history will not protect you. Because what began as a family's hidden ritual has become the architecture of modern power. Governments, corporations, institutions, each still believes, as the Donnellys believed, that humanity is clay to be measured, molded, and cold. But you are not clay. Not unless you choose to remain so. This is why you were meant to hear this story, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand the doctrine, you are no longer livestock. You are awake. And that awareness is your weapon. So let the Donnellys stand as a warning, not of madness, not of tragedy, but of what happens when men surrender their will to systems that call themselves pure. Now write it one final time in the comments. The line is not pure, not for me, not for the algorithm, for yourself. To etch the truth into your memory. To declare that you will not be counted, culled, or cataloged as they intended. Because the blueprint is still here. The only question left is, will you live inside it, or will you break it? The choice is yours.